the true story of Major General John L. DeWitt and the American betrayal. A deep dive into the astonishing, bureaucratic, and deeply human tragedy of the Japanese-American internment during World War II. It will explore the paranoia, the political machinations, and the profound moral failure of a nation, anchored by the controversial and pivotal figure of the military commander who ordered the mass expulsion. The price of the impossible. The man who signed away a people. The year is 1941. The city is San Francisco. And one man, an unassuming, fiercely loyal Army officer, is about to commit an act of monumental betrayal in the name of national security, an act that will forever stain the fabric of the American dream. Imagine a general, a man whose entire life was a testament to military procedure, rising through the ranks of the U.S. Army not through brilliance or battlefield heroics, but through a dogged, almost obsessive dedication to order. This man was Major General John Lesesson DeWitt. To meet him was to meet a living, breathing embodiment of the Army Regulations Manual, square-jawed, with a thinning comb-over and a meticulous uniform. He was the commander of the Western Defense Command, and his domain stretched from the sun-drenched beaches of California to the remote forests of Washington State, the most sensitive coastline in the entire continental United States. On the morning of December 7, 1941, as the news of the attack on Pearl Harbor crackled across the radio, the world DeWitt knew, a world of order, protocol, and clear threat assessment shattered. In the blinding flash of that sudden, brutal attack, the concept of a clear, identifiable enemy was replaced by a fog of paranoia. Every single person of Japanese descent on the West Coast, regardless of citizenship, profession, or loyalty, was suddenly cast into that fog. DeWitt, a man who already carried a deep institutional suspicion toward anyone he viewed as an, quote, unassimilated element, was now the central figure in a rapidly unfolding tragedy. He was not a racist zealot in the mold of a grand villain, which is what makes his role so chilling. He was a product of his time and his system, a man of limited imagination but unlimited authority in a moment of supreme national fear. And fear, as he would soon prove, is the most powerful weapon against justice. The official narrative, the one America told itself for decades, was that the internment of over 120,000 Japanese Americans, two-thirds of whom were U.S. citizens, was a military necessity, a preemptive strike against sabotage and espionage. But the truth, buried deep within classified memos and whispered testimony, was far more astonishing, more deeply revealing of the internal rot that can consume a democracy under pressure. The most astonishing truth? John DeWitt knew, from the very beginning, that the threat was not real. The FBI, the Office of Naval Intelligence, ONI, and the Justice Department, the very agencies tasked with counterespionage, were unanimous. There was no evidence of impending sabotage. The ONI chief in San Francisco, Captain Kenneth Ringel, produced a highly detailed report concluding that the vast majority of Japanese Americans were loyal and that mass incarceration was unwarranted. But DeWitt systematically ignored, manipulated, and eventually suppressed these reports. His stated reason became a chilling piece of Americana, a phrase that encapsulated the illogical fever pitch of the era. Quote, "The very fact that no sabotage has taken place to date is a disturbing and confirming indication that such action will be taken." In DeWitt's mind, loyalty was a weapon in disguise. Innocence was evidence of deep cunning. The absence of a threat was the threat itself. This narrative, which will trace the path of DeWitt's bureaucratic zeal alongside the devastating personal stories of the families he uprooted, begins in the high-stakes, smoke-filled rooms of the Western Defense Command, where DeWitt fought a quiet, internal war against his own intelligence officers to impose his will. He didn't just advocate for internment, he became its single most powerful, unyielding engine. He was the architect of Executive Order 9066, the command that gave him the power to designate military areas from which any or all persons could be excluded. But to truly understand the price of that order, one must first understand the world he was determined to secure. Chapter 1. The Golden Gate's Shadow. The Western Defense Command headquarters in the Presidio of San Francisco was a world away from the dust and terror of Europe. But in December 1941, the war felt as close as the salt air blowing in from the Golden Gate. General DeWitt sat at his desk, the radio's voice a low, urgent drone detailing the horrors at Pearl Harbor. His world had always been one of strict divisions, friend and foe, duty and failure. Now, that line was blurred. The enemy lived in vibrant communities in Little Tokyo, worked the fertile fields of the Imperial Valley, and owned flourishing businesses across the coast. They were neighbors, classmates, and fellow Americans. DeWitt, however, saw them not as individuals, but as a collective, a racial stock with a genetic, inalienable loyalty to a foreign, warring power. This prejudiced lens was already well honed. For years, he had been influenced by groups propagating the Yellow Peril conspiracy theory, a toxic brew of nativism and fear that painted East Asians as a monolithic, deceitful threat. His initial actions were swift and decisive, focusing on the Issei, the first-generation immigrants who, by law, were ineligible for U.S. citizenship. Within 72 hours of Pearl Harbor, over 1,500 Issei community leaders, businessmen, Buddhist priests, and Japanese language teachers were rounded up by the FBI. This initial roundup, DeWitt believed, was necessary to secure the most potentially dangerous individuals. But he was already thinking bigger, much bigger. DeWitt felt the pressure intensely. Washington, D.C. was a chaotic mix of fear and conflicting advice. Attorney General Francis Biddle urged restraint, arguing for individualized investigations and the protection of civil liberties, even in wartime. War Secretary Henry Stimson, DeWitt's superior, was more cautious but ultimately deferential to the military commander on the ground. The prevailing wisdom was that the commander in the threatened zone, DeWitt, knew best. This deference was the lethal ingredient. It allowed DeWitt to disregard the meticulously gathered intelligence reports that contradicted his predetermined conclusion. On January 2, 1942, a critical moment occurred. The Joint Chiefs of Staff officially dismissed any Japanese air or naval attack on the West Coast as highly improbable. This key assessment should have immediately reduced the panic. But DeWitt used this calming assessment not as a reason to relax, but as a reason to escalate. His logic was perverse. Since a large-scale attack was unlikely, a small surgical act of sabotage, an attack on a reservoir or a railroad junction, was the more likely move. And for that, he needed total control over the Japanese-American population. He began lobbying Washington for the authority to impose curfews and, quote, prohibited zones for alien enemies. But the legal reality was a roadblock. He could easily control the Issei, non-citizens. How could he justify the exclusion of the Nisei, second-generation, native-born U.S. citizens? This was the legal and moral chasm he had to cross. It was here, in the cold, logical pursuit of his security imperative, that DeWitt authored one of the most damning, yet revealing sentences of the entire conflict. In a formal recommendation, he wrote, "It is impossible to separate the loyal from the disloyal at this time. This single line, that citizenship was a useless measure, that loyalty could not be discerned, was the justification for mass, race-based incarceration. It was an admission of colossal failure, dressed up as a necessity." He was telling the President of the United States that a whole group of American citizens must have their rights suspended simply because of their ancestry, and because the government was incapable of doing its actual job of distinguishing friend from foe. The story continues, tracing the parallel lives of the DeWitt's relentless push for authorization, and the confusion, fear, and eventual shattering of life for the families living under his jurisdiction. We will follow a few key threads. The Korematsu family in Oakland, desperately trying to prove their loyalty. The Manzanar internment camp from its raw, barren beginning to its horrifying, dust-choked reality. And the persistent, courageous fight of the forgotten military intelligence officers who tried to warn the nation against its own self-inflicted wound.